3 months ago, my supervisor handed me a white envelope and said, "You're 62, Maribel. It's time to let the younger nurses step up." That was it. No warning, no review, just a short conversation in the break room right after I had finished helping a patient who reminded me of my own mother. Inside the envelope was an official letter thanking me for 30 years of service and informing me that my early retirement would take effect in 2 weeks. I stood there holding that paper while my heart felt like it had been punched. After 3 decades of caring for people who had no one else remembering the birthdays of lonely patients, comforting those who were afraid of dying, teaching new nurses how to listen, not just chart, I was being dismissed like a box of expired supplies. The hardest part wasn't the retirement itself. I knew the day would come eventually. It was the way they did it, quietly, coldly. Like my years of service were inconvenient now. Like the fact that I still took time to talk to each patient, to hold a hand, to explain things slowly made me a problem instead of a blessing. They told me the system needed to be more efficient, that personal notes on paper like the ones I kept for patients with dementia or language barriers were outdated and didn't fit the hospital's new digital protocols. My manager even laughed softly and said, "No offense, but your style of nursing belongs to another time." I walked out of that office stunned, not angry, not even sad at first, just invisible, like I had vanished before I ever left. But 2 days later, I received a phone call from a patient's daughter. She had brought her mother in for treatment over a year ago. Her voice cracked as she said, "My mom still asks for you, every time we visit. She remembers how you used to sing to her during blood pressure checks." And that was when it hit me. They had removed me from the building, but not from the lives I had touched. Not from the people who remembered me, not as a name in a database, but as the nurse who looked them in the eye and made them. This is the story of what happened after they pushed me out. It's not a story of revenge, not the kind people expect, but of how doing the right thing, even when no one's watching, can echo louder than you think. It's about how sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is quietly show up for others, until one day they show up for you. And they did, in a way I never saw coming. My name is Maribel Reyes. I was born in El Paso, Texas, and I became a registered nurse at 21, just after my father passed away from a stroke in a crowded county hospital. I remember how lost he looked in those last hours, surrounded by machines, but without anyone to really talk to him. That's when I knew what kind of nurse I wanted to be, the kind who made people feel seen, especially when they were scared. I started working at Meadow Lane Medical Center when I was 32. By then, I had already been through a divorce, raised 2 boys mostly on my own, and learned that life doesn't slow down just because you're tired. Meadow Lane became more than a job. It became a second home. Some of the people I cared for during my first year there later returned as grandparents. Some passed away. Some left little thank you notes that I still keep in a wooden box by my bed. Over time, I became the nurse they called for the difficult patients, the elderly man with Parkinson's who refused to eat unless someone talked to him about old movies, the anxious teenager going through chemotherapy who trusted no one until I sat with her through her entire first treatment, just holding her hand, the war veteran who had a panic attack every time he smelled antiseptic and needed someone who wouldn't rush him through routine checks. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just paid attention. I wrote things down not in the official system, but in my little green notebook. What side the patient preferred to sleep on, whether they liked music playing in the background, what foods they loved or hated, if they had children who visited, or none at all. For patients with memory loss, I learned what they used to do for a living, so I could talk to them about things that made them feel like themselves again. Yes, it took more time, but I learned long ago that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about trust, comfort, dignity. Some of the younger nurses used to roll their eyes at me. They were sweet girls, smart, hardworking, but trained in a system that prioritized checklists and speed. They'd ask, "Why do you waste time learning all that personal stuff?" And I'd smile and say, "Because it matters." There's a certain rhythm to long-term care nursing. You learn how to sense when something's wrong even before the machines do. You notice the small signs: a patient who suddenly goes quiet, or one who doesn't want their usual cup of tea. That kind of attentiveness doesn't show up in charts, but it saves lives. The patients noticed. Their families noticed. Even the janitors and cafeteria workers used to say, "You always make this place feel like home, Maribel." But somewhere along the way, the administration changed. The hospital was acquired by a larger healthcare system, and everything started feeling colder. Performance metrics became stricter. Shift lengths grew longer. Human contact began to shrink in favor of screens and efficiency dashboards. Still, I kept doing what I'd always done. I kept showing up early. I kept sitting with the lonely ones. I kept using my green notebook even though my new supervisor, a young woman named Carla with an MBA and no nursing background, warned me more than once that my non-standard documentation practices could lead to disciplinary action. "You're a sweet person, Maribel," she told me once during a review. "But this isn't how modern healthcare works. We don't have time for emotional bonding. We're here to stabilize and discharge." I said nothing at the time. But in my heart, I knew something she didn't. People don't remember whether you stabilize their blood pressure in 10 minutes. They remember if you looked them in the eye while doing it, if you asked how they slept, if you said, "I'm here," and meant it. So I kept working the way I always had. Not for promotions or praise, but because I believed in the quiet dignity of being present. That's who I was. That's still who I am. A nurse, yes, but more than that, a listener. A keeper of details. A witness to moments that many others pass by. I never imagined that all of that, the very things I thought were small, would be the reason everything changed. The shift in the hospital culture didn't happen all at once. It came like a slow leak in the ceiling, barely noticeable at first, but eventually warping everything beneath it. The first signs were subtle. New protocols arrived in our inboxes weekly, more digital forms, more boxes to check, more efficiency goals to meet. We were told that any patient interaction lasting longer than 8 minutes needed clinical justification. The nursing station got a new wall-mounted screen that displayed every nurse's live productivity rating. How many patients we had seen, how long each interaction lasted, how quickly we charted afterward. At first I ignored it. I had never measured my worth by a timer. But it became clear that others did. Younger nurses began rushing through their rounds, barely looking up from their tablets. Even the kind ones started skipping the little things. No more blankets being tucked gently. No more pausing to ask if someone wanted to pray. Just in and out. Click and move on. My own rating was always at the bottom. I didn't need a screen to tell me that. I was spending too long with patients, especially those who had no visitors or were in emotional distress. I was still reading their body language, noticing when someone's skin tone looked off, or when their smile was more forced than usual. I was doing what I had always done, but now it was being recorded as inefficiency. Then came the reviews. My supervisor Carla began calling me into her office every other month. The conversations were always polite but cold. She'd print out charts showing my interaction averages, then highlight the portions in red. "Maribel, your time per patient is significantly above department average. You're spending 25 minutes with some patients who are only scheduled for vitals and basic checks." I'd try to explain. I'd tell her that Mrs. Hollis had lost her husband 2 weeks ago and needed someone to talk to, that Nguyen didn't speak English well, and it took longer to make sure he understood his medications. That young Katie in room 214 had just gotten a cancer diagnosis and couldn't stop shaking. But Carla would shake her head and tap her pen against the printed reports. "That's not your role. Your job is to administer care, not provide emotional counseling. We have social workers for that. We need consistency, speed, and uniformity." She once said with a tight smile, "You're a good-hearted woman, Maribel. But this isn't the 1990s anymore. Compassion is admirable, but it can't get in the way of system goals." Those meetings always left me drained. I'd go home and sit at my kitchen table staring at my notebook. My sons, both grown with lives of their own, would call and ask how things were going. I never told them everything. I didn't want to sound like I was complaining. But inside, I felt it like I was being quietly erased day by day. One afternoon, Carla announced that we were transitioning to a new streamlined documentation platform, and that all personal notes not entered into the digital system would be considered non-compliant. That meant my green notebook, the one I'd used for years, was now officially against policy. I asked if there was a way to digitize the information. She said no. Those aren't clinical notes. They're personal observations. Not necessary. And frankly, not appropriate. You're building emotional dependency. That word dependency stung more than I expected. Was that what they thought kindness was? A liability? Still, I complied. I locked my notebook in my locker and tried to do things their way. For 2 weeks, I used the digital system only. I followed the timing guidelines, kept conversation to a minimum, and moved through my rounds like I was supposed to. And something awful happened. I began missing things. A patient with dementia who normally hummed quietly started tapping her tray with agitation. I ignored it. Turned out, she was in pain but couldn't verbalize it. Another man with heart failure seemed more anxious than usual. I noted it mentally but didn't waste time on him. He crashed during the night. After those 2 incidents, I couldn't do it anymore. I started using the notebook again in secret. I told myself I was just being careful. But really, I was holding on to the only part of the job that still felt real. Then came the final blow. A new departmental policy was introduced. Nurses over the age of 60 were to be evaluated for phased retirement. I knew what it meant. They were making space. Younger, faster, cheaper hires. Carla didn't even try to pretend otherwise. "It's not personal," she said, handing me the letter. "It's just about future direction." But it was personal. Everything I had poured into that hospital. Every moment of staying late. Every family I sat with through the night. Every time I chose compassion over convenience, none of it mattered anymore. The system had moved on, and there was no place for someone like me in it. I came in early on my final scheduled day long before the rest of the staff arrived. The halls were quiet, still smelling faintly of bleach and breakfast trays. I walked the floor slowly, as if memorizing each room, each corner. I peeked in on room 205, where I'd once held a patient's hand while she took her last breath. I stood quietly outside the pediatric unit, where a young boy with leukemia had once asked me if heaven had video games. Everything felt the same, and yet nothing did. At 10 a.m., they held a retirement celebration for me in the staff lounge, a folding table with a cake, a stack of paper plates. Someone printed out a banner that read, "Congratulations, Maribel," in bright blue letters. Carla stood near the coffee machine, smiling stiffly as she read a short statement about my years of service. "She's been with us for over 30 years," she said, "and has made a meaningful impact on many lives. We wish her well in this next chapter." Polite applause followed. No one mentioned that I hadn't asked to retire, that this wasn't a choice, that I was being phased out because the system had decided I was no longer efficient enough. I smiled, said thank you, and cut the cake. Then I went to my locker, took out my green notebook one last time, and held it for a long moment. Its pages were soft from use, corners. Curled ink faded in places. Inside were notes about people no one remembered. A man who always felt calmer if he could hear jazz while getting his blood drawn. A woman who wanted to be called Nana instead of Mrs. Peterson. A teenager who felt safer if someone stood on his left side, not his right, because of a childhood trauma he never fully explained. That notebook wasn't clinical, but it was sacred. I slipped it into my bag and walked out of the hospital without looking back. The first week at home was the hardest. I kept waking up before dawn, still wired for morning shifts. I'd make coffee, stare out the window, and wonder who was checking on the patients I used to know. Were they being rushed through their assessments now? Were they confused about the new staff, wondering why the nurse who remembered their sister's name wasn't there anymore? I told myself to move on, to rest, to enjoy the quiet, but it didn't feel like peace. It felt like being shelved. Then something unexpected happened. Late one morning, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. "Hi," said a soft voice. "Is this Maribel Reyes?" "Yes, it is. This is Anna. I'm Mrs. Hollis's daughter. You used to care for my mom at Meadow Lane." I sat up straighter. "Oh, yes. I remember her. How is she doing?" There was a pause. "She's confused lately and sad. She keeps asking where the nice nurse went, the one who called her darlin' and brought her little tissues with flowers on them." I felt my throat tighten. She's not adjusting well to the new staff, Anna continued. They're nice, but not the same. She said you used to hum to her while changing her dressings. I smiled even as my heart ached. She always liked old church hymns. Anna sighed. I just wanted to say thank you, and to let you know she hasn't forgotten you. We haven't either. It was a short call, but it left a mark. 2 days later, another call came, this time from a woman whose father I had cared for during a long recovery from surgery. Then another. A former coworker texted me that a few patients had refused their new nurse assignments and kept asking for Maribel with the kind eyes. The calls kept coming slow but steady. They weren't just thank yous. They were reminders that I hadn't been erased, that the care I had given hadn't vanished just because I was no longer wearing scrubs or walking hospital floors. And then, one afternoon, I opened my mailbox and found a card. No return address, just a simple handwritten message inside. You didn't retire. You were reassigned by the people who matter. That's when something shifted. For weeks, I had believed I was no longer needed, that I had become a relic of a different time. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe the way I worked slow, careful, heart first wasn't outdated at all. Maybe it was exactly what people still longed for. Maybe kindness never goes out of style. It just gets harder to find. So I began to wonder, what would happen if I didn't just let this chapter close? What if instead of moving on quietly, I followed the pull in my chest that said, "You're not done yet"? I didn't know it at the time, but that question was about to open a door I never could have predicted. It started slowly. At first, I thought it was just a few kind families reaching out to check in on me. A thank you here, a warm memory there. But then the calls became more frequent, more purposeful. One afternoon, I got a message from the son of Mr. Carlton, a stroke survivor I had cared for last year. He won't let anyone else give him his medication, the son said. He keeps saying, "Where's the nurse who knows I like my water warm, not cold?" He's getting agitated. It's affecting his recovery. A week later, I ran into the daughter of a woman with early-stage dementia at the grocery store. She recognized me immediately and walked over with tears in her eyes. She cries every time someone brings her a lunch tray, she said. She says it doesn't smell right, doesn't feel right. She keeps asking for you. Says you used to touch her shoulder gently before you left the room. I stood in the aisle next to a stack of oranges, unsure what to say. There was no script for this part of nursing. No checklist to explain what happens when your absence lingers longer than your presence was ever allowed to. That same evening, I received a message on social media. A woman I didn't know directly, but whose grandfather had been my patient, had written a post about me. She shared how I used to bring him crossword puzzles after his hip surgery and sit with him on Sundays when her work schedule didn't allow her to visit. That post was shared over 200 times. People began commenting with their own memories. She used to sing to my uncle when he was dying. He said it made him feel less afraid. She remembered my father's birthday, even I forgot one year. She was the only nurse who took time to explain things to my mom in Spanish. The more I read, the more it hit me. These people weren't just being kind. They were grieving the absence of care that felt personal, grieving a style of nursing that had been dismissed as inefficient, grieving a presence that had been quietly erased from their loved ones' lives. One family even told me they had written to the hospital administration asking if I could be reassigned or at least consulted. They said no, the daughter told me. Said you'd officially retired. We didn't believe it. We knew it wasn't by choice. Within days, 2 more families reached out asking if I offered private care. I'm not certified for that, I said gently. They insisted. They said they didn't care about the paperwork. They wanted someone who knew their parents as people, not patient numbers. Someone who remembered how they took their tea, or that they hated the sound of metal utensils scraping against ceramic plates. The tipping point came when a small local newspaper picked up the story. They ran a short piece called "The Nurse Who Never Clocked Out." It featured quotes from families I had cared for describing the difference I had made, the absence they now felt. The article closed with a question: why do we keep letting go of the people who hold us together? After that, the floodgates opened. Messages, letters, emails. Families asking if I could help find them caregivers with my philosophy. Care workers asking if I could teach them how I connected with people so naturally. Nursing students who had shadowed me years ago, now working in other towns, reaching out to say, "You're the reason I chose this path." Even a few of my former coworkers quietly, carefully started writing to me. "I miss seeing how you worked," one wrote. "I feel like the floor's colder now, faster, less human." And then came the message that would change everything. It was from a woman named Delia Ruiz, a clinical director at a private elder care facility called Willow Haven, located in a neighboring town. She had seen the article and several of the online posts. "We've built our reputation on dignity-centered care," she wrote. "But we're missing something, someone who's lived it, not just studied it. We'd like to invite you to speak with our leadership team about designing a new patient experience model." I stared at the email, hardly believing it. Me, a retired nurse with a green notebook and a worn-out pair of walking shoes. I met with Delia and her team the following week. They asked about my approach, my habits, the little things I had done that made people feel safe. I spoke honestly, not like a consultant or expert, just like someone who had learned day by day to listen a little deeper. A few days later, they offered me a position, Director of Patient Experience, full autonomy to train caregivers on emotional intelligence and personal connection. Freedom to design systems that prioritize not just the clinical outcome, but the emotional comfort of every resident. They didn't want me in scrubs. They wanted me in meetings, in trainings, walking the halls, not with a chart, but with intention. I asked for time to consider. And that night, as I sat on my porch with a cup of tea watching the sunset fold into the hills, I realized something simple but powerful. I hadn't lost my place in the world. The world had simply caught up to what I'd been doing all along. I accepted the offer, not immediately and not without hesitation. After 30 years of floor nursing, the idea of stepping into a leadership role, one without scrubs, without direct patient care, felt unfamiliar, maybe even a little hollow at first. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that what they were offering me wasn't a desk or a title. They were offering me a voice. My first day at Willow Haven felt nothing like the hospitals I'd known. The lobby was quiet and warm, filled with sunlight instead of the usual sterile glare. There were fresh flowers on the windowsills. Soft music played in the background. Staff greeted residents by name, by nickname even. I watched an aide kneel beside an elderly woman to help her put on her favorite scarf instead of rushing her through dressing. I knew right away this place wasn't perfect, but it had heart, and it was trying. They gave me a small office near the garden courtyard, but I spent most of my time walking the halls introducing myself to residents and staff. I didn't carry a clipboard or a tablet, just my notebook. A new one this time. The cover was blue. In that first week, I sat down with over 40 residents one by one. I asked them questions, real questions. What made them feel safe? What reminded them of home? What small details did they wish people remembered? Some shared stories about meals from childhood. Others told me about the music their late spouses loved, or how they used to walk every morning before breakfast. A few cried just because someone was finally asking. Then I met with the care team, nurses, aides, housekeepers, kitchen staff, anyone who had direct contact with residents. I didn't lead a seminar. I just started conversations. What do you notice when someone's having a bad day? What's something small you've done that made a resident smile? What do you wish someone had taught you about caring, not just treating? At first, people were shy, but over time they opened up. I could feel it, this gentle shift in the air. People started lingering longer in rooms. Someone set up a birthday calendar. One aide asked if it was okay to bring a resident's favorite herbal tea from home. Another started playing jazz in the common area because she remembered one resident said it reminded him of his dancing days. None of these things required approval or extra budget, just permission to care in a way that felt human. Delia, the clinical director, checked in often. She told me something during our second week that stuck with me. "You're not changing what we do," she said. "You're reminding us why we do it." After a month, families began to notice. One daughter pulled me aside and said, "My dad smiles more. He doesn't even know why. But I think it's because people here are finally seeing him, not just treating him." Another sent a handwritten letter to the administrator. Whoever hired Maribel brought something rare into this place, warmth you can feel even when no one's talking. Perhaps the most surprising change came from the staff themselves. Turnover dropped. People started trading tips about how to make residents feel more comfortable. The break room walls were soon covered with little notes. Mrs. Ellison likes her coffee with a cinnamon stick. Mr. Banner gets anxious when it rains. Tell him about your dog. Ms. Thompson used to teach piano. Ask her about Debussy. Some days I still missed being on the floor hearing the monitor beeps and adjusting IV drips. But then I'd pass by a room and hear a nurse say, "Let's take this a little slower today, okay?" And I'd know this mattered. One afternoon, I walked into the staff lounge and found a group of aides reading from my old green notebook. One of them looked up sheepishly and said, "Hope you don't mind." Delia scanned some of your notes and printed them out for training. "They're kinda magic." I smiled and said, "They're not magic, they're just memories. The kind that help people feel like they're still themselves." And that's what I was building now. Not a program, not a policy, a culture. About 6 weeks after I started at Willow Haven, I got a text from an old colleague at Meadow Lane. It was short and cryptic. "You might want to check the patient satisfaction board." I hadn't thought much about Meadow Lane since leaving. I tried not to. But curiosity got the better of me. I went online and found the hospital's public performance dashboard. They had always taken pride in their rankings, high scores for efficiency, short wait times, clean facility grades. But this time there was something different. Their patient satisfaction rating had dropped significantly. I clicked deeper into the reports. Comments were no longer glowing. Words like cold robotic rushed and impersonal started appearing frequently. One comment read, "Staff seemed too busy to care." I missed the nurse who used to remember my name. Another said everything was technically correct, but it felt like I was just a number. Then came the articles. Local media had picked up on the trend. One outlet ran a story titled, "When Efficiency Replaces Empathy, Are Hospitals Losing Their Humanity?" In it, former patients and family members spoke about a shift in tone and care at Meadow Lane, how something important had gone missing, though no one could quite name it. But I could. It wasn't me they were missing, not personally. It was the space I used to hold, the warmth, the softness, the small but steady human presence that made a hospital feel just a little less frightening. I heard from more people in the weeks that followed. One of the aides I had mentored told me they've started cracking down even more. Less time with patients, more paperwork. We're burning out, no one's smiling anymore. Another message came from my former charge nurse. She didn't sugarcoat it. Upper management won't say it out loud, but they know the drop started right after you left. Carla's been scrambling, trying to launch a new patient connection initiative. It's mostly posters and buzzwords. Nothing real. I learned that they had tried to reassign staff to patients more strategically, pairing familiar faces, optimizing interactions. But it didn't work. Because care isn't something you optimize. It's something you offer. The real blow came when a longtime donor whose mother I had cared for pulled their planned end-of-year contribution. They released a statement saying the hospital had lost touch with the kind of care that puts people first. That hurt to read. Not because it proved anything about me, but because I knew good people still worked there. People who wanted to care deeply, but were trapped in a system that punished them for it. Then came a call I never expected. It was from Carla. She didn't introduce herself right away. I recognized her voice. Measured, crisp, always trying to sound like she was in control. "Hi, Maribel. I hope you're doing well. I've heard you're involved in some consulting work now." I smiled a little at the word involved. "Yes," I said. "I'm working with a facility that emphasizes emotional continuity and care." She hesitated. Then, with a tone that tried to sound casual, said, "We're reviewing some of our practices at Meadow Lane, considering bringing in some outside perspective. There might be an opportunity to, well, perhaps to collaborate." For a long moment, I said nothing. Not because I was angry. I wasn't. But because I realized what this moment really was. It was an admission. Quiet, carefully worded, but clear. I had once been asked to leave because the way I worked didn't align with their future. And now that future was unraveling and they were circling back to the very foundation they'd dismissed. "I appreciate the call," I finally said. "But I'm where I need to be." She cleared her throat. Of course. Just thought I'd reach out." I could have ended it there. But something inside me, maybe mercy, maybe wisdom, added one more thing. Carla, I said gently, it was never about me. It was about how people feel when they're vulnerable. You can't replace human presence with process flowcharts. If you want things to get better, start by asking your staff what they miss about the way it used to feel. She said nothing for a beat, then hung up. A few days later, I received another message, this one from an old patient's daughter. She had moved her mother to Willow Haven. I don't know what it is, she said, but this place feels like people care before they even speak. I smiled, not because it was about me, but because it meant something bigger was working. A ripple that had started with kindness was still moving outward. Back at Meadow Lane, the consequences continued. Staff morale dropped, nurses left, retention rates plummeted. An internal audit reportedly recommended a full overhaul of their patient care philosophy. But by then the damage had been done. I never celebrated their decline. It didn't bring me satisfaction. What brought me peace was knowing that what I had always believed, that human connection matters most, had proven itself. And the world was watching. 2 months after that call with Carla, I received an unexpected email. It came from the office of Meadow Lane's chief medical officer. The subject line read Strategic Patient Care Initiative, Proposal for Collaboration. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but when I opened it there, it was formal, polished, and clearly intentional. They were offering me a contract. The message outlined a new initiative focused on restoring patient trust and improving emotional connection through direct experience-based consultation. They wanted me to serve as a lead advisor, help train staff, and assist in rebuilding community confidence. The compensation was generous. The position came with full decision-making authority over the new program. It was exactly the kind of role I had once dreamed of having. Except now, I no longer needed to dream it. I was already living it. Still, I sat with the offer for a few days. Not because I was tempted, but because I wanted to respond in a way that was clear, calm, and kind. The truth was, part of me had spent years hoping Meadow Lane would see the value in the way I worked. But that hope was long gone now, not out of bitterness, but because I'd learned something better, that sometimes we outgrow the places that couldn't hold space for who we really are. I drafted my reply late one evening, no anger, no scolding, just truth. I wrote, "Thank you for your thoughtful message. I recognize the challenges Meadow Lane is facing, and I respect the effort to course correct. However, I'm not in a place personally or professionally where returning feels aligned with the work I'm doing now. What I offered during my time at Meadow Lane wasn't a model or a method, it was presence. And presence is not something you can insert into a program after the fact. It has to be nurtured from the beginning. I wish you the very best in that process. And I truly hope your patients begin to feel seen again." I sent the message and closed my laptop with a kind of finality I hadn't expected. The next day, I walked into Willow Haven and was greeted by Mr. Lane, a retired teacher who had once taught Shakespeare. He waved as I passed his table and said, "Ah, Maribel," the only person who remembers my favorite sonnet. In the activity room, one of our aides was helping a resident with Parkinson's arrange flowers. They were laughing, nothing clinical about it, just life shared in its ordinary beauty. Later that afternoon, Delia stopped by my office. She had heard about Meadow Lane's offer. "You handled it well," she said. "We're lucky to have you." I looked out the window at a pair of residents sitting side by side sharing a crossword puzzle. "It's funny," I said quietly. "For years, I thought my job was to fix things, heal what was broken. But maybe my real job all along was to remind people that they still matter just as they are." Delia nodded. "You've reminded all of us." And that's when I knew for certain. I hadn't been dismissed. I had been released so that I could return to the work in its purest form, without compromise, without needing permission. I didn't go back because the door behind me had already closed. Not with bitterness, but with grace. And in front of me another door had opened, one where people listened, one where presence was not considered inefficiency, but purpose. 2 years have passed since the day I walked out of Meadow Lane, with a green notebook in my bag and no real plan in my heart. And yet, not a week goes by that I don't think about those final moments. The look on Carla's face, the silence in the staff lounge, the uneasy air of people knowing something unfair had just happened, but not knowing what to do about it. I used to replay that scene in my mind, wondering if I should have said more, stood up taller, defended myself louder. But now I realize silence was its own kind of strength. Not the silence of defeat, but of clarity. The kind that says I don't need to prove my worth to people who chose not to see it. At Willow Haven, things are different. We don't have state-of-the-art equipment or the most advanced software. But we have stories. Stories taped beside residents' beds, small notes about their favorite books, what calms them during thunderstorms, what their laugh sounds like when they really mean it. We've trained every new staff member in something we call First Five. The first 5 minutes of every shift are dedicated to one thing: connection. Not charting, not vitals, just noticing. Saying a resident's name with warmth, asking a question, listening. That simple practice has transformed everything. Families tell us they feel like their loved ones are being known, not just cared for. Staff say their days feel more meaningful even when they're hard. Residents smile more. They remember more. They trust more. As for me, I've never felt more whole. I'm no longer just a nurse or a consultant or a former employee of a place that couldn't hold my heart. I am in every sense of the word present. And I've learned that presence, real, honest presence, is one of the most powerful gifts we can give another person. There's something I want to say, especially to anyone reading this who has ever been made to feel replaceable. You are not your job title. You are not your productivity score. You are not how fast you complete a task or how quiet you stay in meetings. You are the quiet moment that made someone feel safe, the kind word that helped someone breathe a little easier, the memory someone still carries even when you're no longer there. And if a place, a person, or a system tells you otherwise, don't bend yourself to fit it. Walk forward, not in anger, but in truth. Because somewhere out there, someone is waiting for the very thing you offer naturally. Someone is searching for a caregiver who remembers, for a teacher who listens, for a leader who sees. And when you arrive, they will not ask you to change. They will say, "Where have you been that more than any title or recognition is what I carry now?" A life not built on climbing ladders, but on standing firm in who I am. And what started with one green notebook in the bottom of my locker is now a philosophy shared across teams, homes, and hearts. I didn't return to Meadow Lane, but in a way I never had to. Because the work I did there, the quiet, unseen, often dismissed work, has grown far beyond those hospital walls. It lives in the way my staff greets each other, in the way residents feel held even in their most fragile moments, in the way we all remember people first always. That's the kind of legacy no one can delete.